To discuss this, I'm joined now from Sarajevo by Emir Suljagic. He was Bosnia's Deputy Minister of Defense and now teaches at the International University of Sarajevo. In Lisbon is Nerma Jelacic. She's a former spokeswoman for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague. And from London, we have international affairs analyst Marko Gasic. He was formerly with the Serbian Information Center. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Nerma Jelacic, let me start with you. There was a massive release of emotions from the survivors when they heard the verdict and the sentencing. Has justice been served?
Absolutely. Indeed, it might become a little bit too late. Some of the survivors, I myself am aware of a number of mothers from Srebrenica, for example, who never lived to hear the final judgment to Radovan Karadzic. But compared to some other conflicts I'm working on now, such as that in Syria, this is a huge message. Justice is possible. Yes, sometimes it's late, but he has been sentenced and he'll spend the rest of his life in prison.
Marko, justice?
No, more like Victor's justice or US justice, because we should understand that this so-called justice has been provided by a tribunal which has been dreamed up, set up, financed and almost entirely staffed by the US. With its hangers-on. So essentially, they're designed to produce a verdict that would suit US foreign policy. And the US has a very great interest in dreaming up this exaggerated story of Srebrenica in order to justify bombing countries in the future to prevent supposed future Srebrenicas. And the main victims of this US policy and this US justification are actually Muslim countries themselves, be it in Syria or Libya or Iraq or elsewhere. Okay. I'd remind us that the mother of the tribunal is Madeleine Albright, who cared so much about Iraqi children that she was happy to consider 500,000 Iraqi deaths was worth it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Nerma, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that in a moment because you worked within the system and you can address whether it was, just American hands behind everything that you guys did. But Emir, we spoke before we heard the verdict and now we're speaking after we heard the verdict. Is this justice and closure for those Bosniaks who were killed at the hands of Karadzic?
Well, there's a number of questions that need to be tackled here. One is the question of what is actually justice for the kind of crimes that Radovan Karadzic was accused and eventually convicted of. Hannah Arendt referred to that particular type of crimes as crimes which men can neither punish nor forgive. So the question of what is, for instance, a just sentence for cramming up a room full of men from a village and then raping 13-year-old boys or forcing fathers and sons to copulate in front of all of their neighbors for days on end, how do you justly punish that? So that's question number one. Question number two is, what is the point of punishing Mr. Karadzic if his life's work that came about as a result of prosecution of genocidal strategy of physical removal and annihilation of non-Serbs from what is today known as so-called Republika Srpska? What is the point of that? Imagine leaving after World War II a part of Germany in the hands of Nazis. Would Germany be the country it is today? Would Europe be what it is today? And third, on a more practical level, it's a shame and it's a shortcoming on the part of the tribunal that it didn't go any further in examining the relationship and the direct links that were demonstrated during the Milosevic trial between Belgrade and Bosnian Serbs. For all intents and purposes, Republika Srpska did not exist except as a form of occupation by Serbia of Bosnian territory. So that's one of the serious shortcomings of the procedure. So the bottom line is, Mr. Karadzic will probably spend the rest of his life in prison. It's a welcome step, but ultimately it means nothing.
Okay, and Nerma, let me get you to respond. Essentially, the court was working in the interests of geopolitics and not justice, according to Marko. Respond to that.
Well, it's of course absolutely wrong, because the ICTY was established by a unanimous resolution of the United Nations Security Council, which means that the Russian hand went up when the vote came about. So that's a fact. It's a historic fact, and it remains so. Of course, the Russians are today critical not only of ICTY but of any mechanism of international criminal justice, and have recently said that they will never support an establishment of another tribunal or court for any conflict situation. So these are, the realities of geopolitics today, and why the Syrians are not likely to see any justice delivered in the form of that we've seen yesterday in The Hague. Now, another issue raised quite rightly so by Emir Suljagic is indeed the question of the limited reach of international criminal law. And the judgment has been issued. It is mainly pertaining to the individual criminal responsibility of Radovan Karadzic himself, but the impact of that judgment is not something that the tribunal or the mechanism now can control, and no court can do that. It is up to the politicians now to make something meaningful out of the judgment. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. What we have seen is statements from international politicians hoping that this has given some closure to the victims, reconciliation will advance, which are just empty phrases, unfortunately, because international politicians, including America, unlike what Marko there said, is not really interested in Bosnia very much these days. So, and indeed, the domestic politicians or politicians in Bosnia, no matter which side, are also very immature and unlikely to advance the reconciliation.
Okay, Marko, at the heart of it all, do you believe that Karadzic is an innocent man?
What does innocent mean? In a war, probably he had to make tough decisions, but on the charges that we've seen here, yeah, I do believe he's innocent. I believe that we've been given a absolutely distorted version of something. He essentially was a fairly normal politician. He signed up in 1992 to a peace deal that would have meant no war in Bosnia at all. It was torpedoed by Warren Zimmerman of the USA. So if he'd wanted war and wanted ethnic cleansing, as the propaganda claims, he wouldn't have signed up for peace without war immediately at the first chance he got. So yeah, I do think he's innocent. And I think that these stories about both Sarajevo and Srebrenica are vast distortions fomented really by a tribunal which has no proper rules of procedure. Norma says that it was formed by the UN Security Council. It was indeed, but the Security Council had no right to form a judicial body. It was formed in essence illegally, and it went downhill after that in all aspects. From double jeopardy, from use of hearsay evidence, from rewriting indictments when it didn't suit it. And from accepting evidence from people that it deemed itself to be mentally ill, like the main plank against Karadzic is the testimony of one Dražen Erdemovic, who was ruled mentally ill to stand in his own case, so and 6 weeks later was allowed to testify against Karadzic.
So Marko, let me take what you said.
Tribunal functioning.
Fair enough. Okay. So Emir, you heard what Marko said. A lot of people believe what Marko said. A lot of Serbs believe what Marko said. We've also had Milorad Dodik, the Bosnian Serb leader in the leadership, calling the decision arrogant and cynical and accusing the tribunal of once again being anti-Serb. With all of that in mind, is this decision just going to make things worse in Bosnia-Herzegovina between Bosnian Serbs and everybody else?
First of all, we cannot negotiate the facts. The facts are what they are. And we're not going to be able to meet anyone, whether Mr. Gasic or Dodik, halfway when it comes to the facts. That's number one. Number two, what Mr. Gasic is saying and what Mr. Dodik is saying is a testament to, or a confirmation of what I had just said. Mr. Karadzic may well spend the rest of his life in prison, but his life's work, which is genocidal removal of non-Serbs from what is today known as Republika Srpska has succeeded. He's now an inspiration to extremists globally. There isn't much difference between what Mr. Gasic is saying and what is being said in the far-right crusade-inspired circles in Western Europe and the United States, Australia or New Zealand. The genocidal murder of the Bosnian Muslims has served as global inspiration to people now shooting Muslims in mosques all over the world. Karadzic was and does still has a certain heroic status.
Right.
In these
okay. So let's get Mr. Gasic to
just address something.
Okay.
Sorry,
very briefly.
Just
yes.
address that I need to address, Mr. Gasic. You're talking to two survivors here. Ms. Jelacic is from Visegrad, where they crammed people into a house and burned them alive. I'm from Bratunac, and then from Bratunac, where they also did that, I moved on to Srebrenica and somehow survived. So unless you're capable of speaking of these crimes with at least a modicum of respect for the survivors and for the victims, and with a modicum of dignity, then try and refrain from the comments at all.
Okay,
all right?
Okay, so Marko, did they just make it up? They experienced it, they lived it.
They lived it. It's funny how Mr. Suljagic from Bratunac didn't live the murder of up to 100 Serbians in Bratunac well before July 1995, killed in the most brutal of circumstances, including an 82-year-old woman who has knife imprints on her hands as she lifted them to defend herself. It's funny that Mr. Suljagic didn't notice it while he was observing the Bosnian situation. And when I was there observing the Bosnian situation, I still remember a shell landing in Brčko, where Karadzic was due to be, and it killed a pregnant woman and her son. And I was in that room looking at that woman's brain, and the Bosnian Muslim Army said it was a postcard to Karadzic. So let's not start throwing bloodthirsty stories at each other. Let's get to the essential nature of this. And the essential nature of this is a war fomented from outside, which found local allies among the Bosnian Muslims who would have been better off staying with the Serbians in the same country of Yugoslavia, where everyone was in their own country, not separated into little Mickey Mouse satellite states as we have today, where they are all totally supplicants to the western part of the international community.
Marko, are you comfortable with the fact that Brenton Tarrant, the Australian who shot up the two mosques, was listening to a song praising Karadzic on the way to his ghastly act?
For me, Imran, it sums it up. The US spreads a load of propaganda designed to present the Serbs as kind of bestial fiends determined to destroy anything and everything, supported by the ex-Bosnian defense minister, Mr. Suljagic. So we have the propaganda against the Serbs, and then no wonder sickos think the Serbs are the ones to follow. The racist depiction of the Serbs in the Western media has been, if it was said about Jews or about Muslims, we would all be protesting, but it seems that Serbs are fair game. And if lunatics then want to follow the images created by the propaganda ministry of Washington, and then you blame the Serbs for that, well, I'd say
you
that's
find
really
it's
rich.
in Washington.
We get blamed and we get bombed.
Nerma, wrap us up. We don't have much time. Wrap us up, please.
Well, I'll just make one statement, really, and that's indeed some victims and witnesses' testimonies contributed to the conviction of Karadzic, but in the end, what convicted him are thousands of pages of documentation that originates from the SDS, the Serbian Democratic Party, which he was leader of, VRS, the military arm of the Republika Srpska, etc. So thousands of documents written by the hand of subordinates of Karadzic, some of them written by Karadzic himself, intercepted conversations. These are the king and queen of evidence that found Karadzic, the genocidal maniac, and convicted him for life. These are the facts that will remain and are available in open source to the public. I know Mr. Marko is not going to read this, but the hope is that the future generations will.
Nerma Jelacic, Emir Suljagic, and Marko Gasic, I thank you for joining us here on the Newsmakers.